Do you still remember that during the campaign, President Trump made a bold promise that he would be able to make Russia and Ukraine ceasefire within 24 hours of taking office? But now, he may regret making this promise a little, because ending the Russian-Ukrainian war is much more complicated than he originally imagined. On April 17th, at the consultation meeting on Ukraine held in France, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio said that the United States has lost patience in the negotiations on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He said, "If there is no signal that Russia and Ukraine have reached an agreement in the short term, the United States will not continue to mediate." His statement was the first to express to the outside world the helplessness and fatigue of President Trump's team on the Russian-Ukrainian issue. On April 18th, President Trump confirmed Secretary of State Rubio's views at a press conference at the White House. President Trump clearly announced that if the negotiations on the Ukrainian issue cannot make clear progress in the short term, the United States will no longer participate in mediation. This fully shows that President Trump has become frustrated in resolving the Russian-Ukrainian war. How did things develop to this point? Let's take a brief look back. In January 2025, after President Trump returned to the White House, he began his road to peace mediation between Russia and Ukraine. He took a series of measures to try to build a bridge of communication between Russia and Ukraine. However, the reality is much more complicated than he expected. In a meeting with President Trump at the White House, Ukrainian President Zelensky publicly expressed his dissatisfaction with U.S. policies and even had a fierce dispute with President Trump. This scene not only embarrassed those present, but also showed the world how difficult the Russian-Ukrainian issue is. In anger, President Trump drove Zelensky out of the White House, an incident that aroused strong dissatisfaction in Europe. European countries generally believe that President Trump is somewhat partial to Russia in the face of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and is not supportive enough for Ukraine. They accuse the United States of abandoning Ukraine at a critical moment, putting Ukraine, an already fragile country, in a more difficult situation. On the Russian side, although Putin has repeatedly praised President Trump in public and called him the best president, the Russian offensive has become more fierce on the battlefield. His inconsistent attitude also made President Trump very frustrated. Since January this year, President Trump has been trying hard to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. President Trump signed an executive order to suspend all U.S. foreign aid programs for 90 days, the largest of which was to Ukraine. He also temporarily suspended the shipment of weapons to Ukraine in an attempt to force Ukraine to make concessions in the negotiations. However, these measures did not achieve the desired effect. Ukraine did not soften its position, but instead strengthened its determination to resist Russia on the battlefield. At the same time, President Trump is also trying to reach some kind of compromise with Russia. He spoke to Putin twice, trying to ease tensions between the two sides through diplomatic means. He also threatened that if Russia did not cooperate with the ceasefire, the United States might impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil buyers. However, Putin did not change his strategy, and the Russian army's offensive remained fierce. Since April, President Trump's special envoys have met with Russian President Putin twice to discuss the conditions for ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. However, these efforts ultimately failed to achieve a substantial breakthrough. So far, the United States has only reached a ceasefire agreement on energy facilities through mediation, and this agreement has expired on April 17th. At present, Russia and Ukraine have not accepted President Trump's mediation, and the conflict has intensified. With no hope of a ceasefire in the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Trump administration has begun to turn its attention to Ukraine's mineral resources. They hope to make up for the loss of U.S. aid to Ukraine by reaching a mineral agreement with Ukraine. However, this plan has not been smooth sailing. As early as February 28th, Zelensky went to the White House to sign a mineral agreement, but he quarreled with President Trump and Vance, and the agreement was not reached, and he was kicked out of the White House. It was not until April 17th that the United States and Ukraine signed a memorandum of intent on the Ukrainian mineral agreement online. The next step is to wait for the text of the agreement to be finalized and signed and submitted to the parliaments of the two countries for approval. One of the core contents of this memorandum is the establishment of a Ukrainian Reconstruction Investment Fund. The establishment of this fund aims to attract investment from the United States and the international community to Ukraine and support Ukraine's economic reconstruction and development after the conflict. However, this agreement has also caused a lot of controversy. During the negotiations, the U.S. government relaxed the conditions for Ukraine to repay the aid, and the estimated amount of aid was lowered from about $300 billion to about $100 billion, close to the amount previously announced by Ukraine. The setbacks encountered by President Trump in resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict are not only his personal setbacks, but also reflect some deep-seated problems of the United States in international affairs. The United States policy toward Russia has long been constrained by various domestic political factors. President Trump's policy toward Russia may not be the mainstream will of the United States' overall strategy toward Russia. When many political forces in the United States hope that the Russia-Ukraine war will continue, President Trump's efforts to end the Russia-Ukraine war will inevitably face huge resistance. His efforts not only failed to change the situation of the conflict, but to a certain extent exacerbated the contradictions and confrontations between the parties. In addition, President Trump's distinctive personal style also had a negative impact on his efforts to end the Russia-Ukraine war. President Trump is accustomed to making bold promises before taking action, but has been repeatedly frustrated in actual actions. This personal style has also caused him to be questioned in the international community. What impression did President Trump present to the world in the process of handling the Russia-Ukraine conflict? He has expressed his dissatisfaction with Putin, shown a tough attitude towards Zelensky, and made European allies feel ignored. All of these reflect to a certain extent that President Trump's administration is not mature enough in handling diplomatic affairs. The Russian-Ukrainian war, which lasted for more than 3 years, was caused by very complicated reasons involving historical, ethnic, political, economic, and other factors. The United States tried to solve this problem through simple diplomatic mediation, which obviously underestimated the complexity of the conflict. Although the United States' military aid to Ukraine and economic sanctions against Russia have strengthened its support for Ukraine to a certain extent, they cannot fundamentally change the direction of the conflict. On the contrary, these measures may have exacerbated the conflict in some aspects. President Trump's efforts and setbacks on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict reveal the complexity and uncertainty in international politics. A country's leaders, despite their great power and influence, often need more cautious and pragmatic strategies when facing complex international situations. For leaders of countries around the world, this incident also reminds them that in international affairs, the gap between commitments and actions can be large. The decision-making of national leaders should not only consider domestic political factors, but also fully recognize the complexity and diversity of international relations. Of course, President Trump's efforts to end the Russian-Ukrainian war are commendable, and this also shows us the difficulty and importance of peacefully resolving international conflicts. In the pursuit of world peace, all countries need to pay more patience, wisdom, and cooperation. Welcome to subscribe to my channel, where I share with you in-depth views on important global affairs every day. See you next time.